Carol, at 68, had always believed that the greatest legacy she had built was her family bakery, where every loaf of bread told a story. But when her only son schemed to take it, she suddenly realized her true legacy wasn't in a secret recipe, but in the 40 years of relationships she had cultivated in the heart of the town. And now she would use that very intangible legacy to reclaim everything. Saturday mornings at the Golden Crust always had a special magic. The warm air, carrying the scent of butter and caramelized sugar, embraced anyone who stepped through the time-worn oak door. The air was thick with the aroma of baking bread, freshly ground coffee, and a hint of rich cinnamon. Carol stood behind the counter, her kind eyes twinkling more brightly than the glaze on the cinnamon rolls. She wasn't just an owner, she was the soul of the place. People didn't just come to buy a loaf of bread, they came for her smile, to exchange a bit of gossip, to feel a piece of the town's warm memories. "Mrs. Carroll, my usual rye, please," called out Mr. Miller, a loyal customer of 30 years. "Still warm, Mr. Miller," Carol replied, her hands deftly wrapping the loaf in wax paper. "And I've saved a small piece of apple tart for you. Don't tell your wife." Mr. Miller let out a hearty laugh, the smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. That was the Golden Crust, not just a shop, but a connection. After handing the loaf to Mr. Miller, Carol turned to the open kitchen behind her. There, amidst a delicate dusting of flour, was her future. Lily, her 20-year-old granddaughter, was intensely focused, her skilled hands folding the thin layers of dough for a batch of traditional croissants. Her honey-colored hair was tied up in a bun, a few stray strands clinging to her perspiring forehead. She looked so much like Carol in her younger years. "Gently, my dear," Carol said softly, placing her hand over her granddaughter's. "Feel the dough. It should be cool, elastic, as if it's talking to you. Your grandfather Arthur used to say that each layer is a promise of crispiness." Lily looked up, her hazel eyes shining with admiration. "Grandma, I don't think I'll ever be as good as you." "Nonsense," Carol laughed, casually wiping a smudge of flour from Lily's cheek. "You have a love for it. That's the most important ingredient no recipe can ever write down." The two of them worked together in a comfortable silence, a familiar dance of hands and hearts. In Lily's passionate gaze, Carol saw not only herself, but also Arthur, her late husband. He was the one who had built this place with her from scratch, the one who believed that a good loaf of bread could heal almost any wound. The bell on the door chimed again, but this time the sound seemed to carry a different tone. Robert, her son, and Susan, her daughter-in-law, walked in. Robert in an expensive business suit and Susan in a cream-colored silk dress, they looked out of place in the rustic bakery. "Hi, Mom," Robert said, his voice a bit rushed. "You're still working so hard." "Hello, you two," Carol smiled, wiping her hands on her apron. "You're just in time. The croissants are about to come out of the oven." "We can't stay long," Susan replied quickly, her eyes scanning the shop, lingering on the old pine shelves. "Just dropping by to see how you are. You should be resting more these days. Lily can handle things now." Robert nodded in agreement, his gaze drifting out the window to the shop across the street with a "for lease" sign. "I see the rent in this area is skyrocketing, a fantastic investment opportunity. People are flocking here." A vague sense of unease crept into Carol's heart. Their words, though cloaked in concern, smelled of pragmatism. She brushed it aside, telling herself she was being too sensitive. They were just worried about her. "I'm still plenty healthy," she said. "This place keeps me busy. Would you two like some coffee?" "No thanks, we have a meeting," Robert said, glancing at his watch. They stayed for a few more minutes, asking a few hollow questions before quickly leaving. Carol watched them go. the feeling of unease still lingering. She sighed, turning back to Lily and the fragrant batch of pastries fresh from the oven. Perhaps she was just overthinking things. Of course, we'll continue Carol's story right away, delving deeper into the slowly appearing cracks and the moment the harsh truth is revealed. After the golden brown croissants were neatly arranged on the tray, Robert approached the counter where Carol was carefully writing in the old ledger. "Mom," he began, his tone casual, "I see you're still doing the books by hand. How about I help you modernize things a bit? We could move everything to a computer, manage orders online. It'd be much more efficient, and you'd have more time to rest." Carol looked up and put down her pen. Her smile was still gentle, but her eyes held a hint of distance. "Thank you, Robert, but I like the old way. It helps me remember each customer's name, what kind of bread they like. To me, it's not a job, it's care." Her polite but firm refusal made Robert pause. He was about to say something more, but just then Susan's phone rang. Her expression immediately tensed. "I have to take this," she said quickly and stepped outside. Susan's conversation was short but stressful. When she came back in, she seemed flustered. "We have to go now. Something urgent came up." In their haste to gather their bags and coats, no one noticed that Susan had left a luxurious black leather folder on the small table in the corner where they had been sitting. When the shop door closed, returning the familiar quiet, Carol finally let out a sigh. But the feeling of unease remained, lingering like a strange scent. She cleared the coffee cups they had used, and then her eyes fell on the leather folder. It lay there, silent and out of place in the cozy atmosphere of the bakery. At first, she thought about calling Robert to let him know, but a sense of curiosity, a bad feeling, stayed her hand. Maybe she should just take a quick look to make sure it wasn't anything too important. She picked up the folder, feeling the expensive quality of the soft leather. There was no name, no label. She hesitated for a second, then opened it. Her heart seemed to skip a beat. Inside was not a contract or personal documents. It was a professional, extremely detailed real estate analysis. Page after page contained planning maps of the neighborhood, data on land values, commercial potential, and calls for investment projects. And then she saw it. On the last page, on the overall map of the entire area, the lot of the Golden Crust Bakery was circled in a thick red line. Beside it, a scrawled but clear handwritten note, "Prime location, highest development potential, priority for clearance." The air was sucked out of Carol's lungs. Her trembling hands turned to the appendix. Tucked inside was a business card. Apex Real Estate Group, building the future. Carol's world, a world built of flour, butter, and love, had just developed a deep, gaping crack. Her son and daughter-in-law's visit wasn't about concern. It was a survey. Carol couldn't sleep. She sat alone in the darkness of the closed bakery. The silvery moonlight streamed through the window, casting ethereal patches of light on the floor, on the empty tables and chairs. The smell of bread still lingered, but tonight it no longer brought warmth, only deepening her loneliness. Every word Robert and Susan had said echoed in her mind, now taking on a completely different meaning. You should rest more, so they could easily take over. A fantastic investment opportunity, an opportunity built on her sacrifice. That folder wasn't accidentally left behind. It was a message, a declaration of war they hadn't realized they had revealed. She realized that to them, the Golden Crust was not a legacy holding the memories of 3 generations. It was just a plot of land, an asset that could be converted into cash. A sharp pain rose within her, more piercing than any disappointment she had ever felt. The pain of betrayal from the very son she had spent a lifetime loving. But as the tears streamed down her cheeks, another feeling began to rise from the depths: anger, a smoldering but steady flame. She had spent her life building, protecting. She had fought alongside Arthur to keep this place alive through the toughest economic times. She would not let it be destroyed by her own son's greed. A direct confrontation? She pictured the scene. Robert would deny everything. Susan would use sweet words to placate her, calling her senile, paranoid. They would turn her into a delusional old woman, no longer in her right mind. No, she couldn't win that way. Carol stood up, her calloused hand gliding over the familiar wooden counter. No, she would not be on the defensive. She would attack, but in her own way, the way of a woman who had lived in this town for nearly 70 years, who knew every person, every street corner, who had built a legacy far greater than the walls of this bakery. They wanted a war over property. She would give them a war of humanity. Carol's world had been turned upside down by the very people she loved most. She decided she would no longer be silent. What would you do in her situation? Don't forget to comment below where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. Now, Carol must decide on her first move in the fight to reclaim her heritage. The dawn of Monday brought a cold clarity. The shock and pain of the weekend had subsided, replaced by a determination as solid as a well-proofed dough. Carol was no longer the gentle woman who only knew the scent of butter and milk. The sleepless night had turned her into a strategist. She started her new day not by kneading dough, but by making a phone call. "Henry, it's Carol," she said, her voice warm and friendly. "It's been too long. Are you free for a coffee this morning? I have something I'd like to ask a wise man like you about." Mr. Henry Henderson, an old friend of Arthur's and a senior member of the City Planning Council, happily agreed. They didn't meet at the Golden Crust. Carol chose a small cafe on the other side of town, a neutral place. After a few pleasantries about grandchildren and back pain, Carol skillfully steered the conversation. "Henry, I've noticed our neighborhood has been changing a lot lately. The shop across from my bakery has a for lease sign up again." Mr. Henderson took a sip of his coffee, lowering his voice as if about to reveal a state secret. "Change is just the beginning, Carol. You have to hear this. The Apex Real Estate Group, you know, the one building the complex on the west side, they're looking to acquire our entire block." Carol's heart tightened, but she kept her expression calm. "Really? What are they planning to do?" "A high-rise building. Offices, luxury apartments, a shopping center. A huge project. They've already submitted a preliminary proposal and are in the lobbying phase. They promise to change the face of the downtown area." Mr. Henderson sighed. "To me, it sounds more like erasing the face." "Have they approached the shop owners yet?" Carol asked, trying to keep her voice from trembling. "Not publicly, but I've heard they're sending people to survey and appraise. That's how the big players operate, Carol. They never show up until the game is already decided." Carol nodded, carefully tucking the precious information away. She now had the name of the enemy behind her son. This fight was bigger than she thought. After leaving the cafe, Carol's next destination was the warehouse of George, her flour supplier for the past 20 years. The air inside was thick with the smell of grain and paper bags. George, a large man with calloused hands and a hearty laugh, was carrying a sack of flour on his shoulder. Mrs. Carroll, what brings you here? I came to thank you, George, Carol said, getting straight to the point. George put the sack down, wiping his hands on his flour-dusted apron. Thank me for what? For being a good friend, for telling me the truth. George's expression turned serious. He knew what she was talking about. I was going to call you. Your son, Robert, he came here last week. He wasn't his usual self. He asked about the books, about the bakery's revenue. He even hinted at an exclusive contract with a better price if I just gave him a few numbers. And what did you say? I told him that the business between you and me is not just numbers on an invoice. It's the handshake of your late husband 20 years ago. I told him that trust is not something to be bargained with. George looked Carol straight in the eye. He's up to no good, Mrs. Carroll. Be careful. Carol nodded, a warmth of gratitude spreading through her chest, chasing away some of the cold of betrayal. Her and Arthur's legacy was more than just baking recipes. When she returned to the bakery late in the afternoon, Lily was there, her face worried. Grandma, I just talked to Mom, Lily began, her voice hesitant. She called and asked me all sorts of things, and then she said that she and Dad are very worried about you. Oh, really? Carol said, her hand calmly wiping the glass counter. She asked if you've been forgetful lately. She brought up how last weekend Mr. Miller changed his mind from rye to white bread, and you were confused for a moment. She said you're working too hard and are no longer clear-headed enough to manage everything. She said she's afraid you'll be taken advantage of. Carol stopped, looking directly at her granddaughter. Lily, do you remember the situation with Mr. Miller? Lily nodded immediately. Yes, he changed his mind 3 times. I heard him. You weren't confused at all. You even joked at a man's mind changes as often as the weather in March. Everyone in the shop laughed. Carol smiled, a sad but steady smile. She placed her hand on Lily's shoulder. They're trying to divide us, my love. They're trying to plant doubt in your mind, to make you think I'm no longer trustworthy. Because they know, as long as we stand together, they will never achieve their goal. Lily's eyes welled up, not with fear, but with anger and understanding. She threw her arms around her grandmother. I will never doubt you, never. Carol held her granddaughter tight. The battle had officially begun on all fronts. Robert and Susan didn't just want the land. They wanted to destroy trust, to sever family ties. But they had made a fatal mistake. They had underestimated the bond between the 2 women of the Golden Crust. The following days, a tense silence enveloped their relationship. Robert and Susan did not visit the bakery. Carol knew this was not remorse, but preparation. Like the calm before a storm, the air grew thick and heavy. Along with Lily, she continued her daily work, but both of them knew they were in the eye of the storm. And then, Robert's next move came on a Thursday afternoon via a phone call. Mom, Robert's voice came through, sickeningly sweet. Susan and I have been thinking a lot. We're really worried about your health and your future. We've found someone wonderful. He's a legacy planning expert, specializing in helping families preserve their assets for future generations. Carol gripped the phone, the word preserve sounding like a mockery. She remained silent, letting Robert continue. He's agreed to come to our house this Sunday afternoon to talk with you, completely free of charge, just to help you get your papers in order, to make sure everything is taken care of. What do you think? A trap coated in a thick layer of concerned words. They planned to corner her in her own home with an expert and a stack of pre-written documents. Carol's heart pounded, but her voice remained completely calm. "Oh, you two are so thoughtful," she said, her voice slightly naive. "Sunday? Okay. I've been meaning to sort some things out anyway." "That's great, Mom," Robert exclaimed, unable to hide his triumphant tone. "We'll see you at 2 p.m. on Sunday then." As soon as she hung up, Carol immediately made 2 other phone calls. The first call was to her lawyer. "Michael, I need you at my house at 2 p.m. on Sunday. My son is bringing an expert to help me sign away my life. I want you there to review everything carefully." The second call was the move that would change the entire game. "Dana, is that you? It's Carol from the Golden Crust," she said with a warm voice. Dana was a well-known freelance journalist in the area who had once written a beautiful article praising her bakery as the nostalgic heart of the town. "Mrs. Carroll, it's so good to hear from you." "You too, Dana. Listen, I loved your article. And this Sunday, something quite interesting is happening. I'm having a meeting with some planners to discuss the future legacy of the bakery. I thought it might be a wonderful follow-up story to your article about how a family business plans for the next generation, a real human interest story." The excitement in Dana's voice was palpable. "Oh my, Mrs. Carroll, that's a fantastic idea. I will definitely be there." Carol smiled. "Wonderful. I'll see you at 2. On Sunday afternoon, Carol's house was filled with the scent of chamomile tea and the butter cookies she had just baked. She looked every bit the gentle mother and grandmother waiting for her children, with no sign of a woman preparing for battle. Robert and Susan arrived with a man in his 50s wearing a gray suit, his hair slicked back, and carrying an alligator leather briefcase. "Mom, this is Mr. Sterling, the expert I told you about," Robert introduced. Mr. Sterling shook Carol's hand, a limp and cold handshake. "A pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Hale. Your son and daughter-in-law are truly concerned about your future." "Please have a seat," Carol said, gracefully gesturing to the sofa. Just as they settled in, Mr. Sterling opened his briefcase, revealing a thick stack of papers. But before he could say a word, the doorbell rang. "Oh, that must be my friend," Carol said, and went to open the door. Lawyer Michael walked in, elegant and composed. Robert and Susan were stunned. "Mom, you invited Lawyer Michael too?" Susan stammered. "Of course," Carol replied nonchalantly. "We're discussing important legal documents. It's better to have a lawyer present." Their faces turned sour, but they tried to remain calm. Mr. Sterling seemed a bit flustered, but he continued professionally. "Well, then let's begin. As I was explaining to Mr. Robert and Miss Susan..." Ding-dong. The doorbell rang once more. "That must be another guest," Carol said, her smile now holding a hint of mischief. "My house is so lively today." The door opened, and Dana walked in, a notebook and a recorder in her hand, a radiant smile on her face. "Mrs. Carroll, thank you for inviting me. I'm so excited to hear about the future of the Golden Crust." Robert and Susan were just stunned before. Now their faces were as white as flour. Panic and anger were evident in their eyes. They looked at Carol, then at Dana, then at the stack of papers on the table. The trap had been sprung, but they were the ones caught in it. Carol, now in complete control, gracefully took on her role. "Dana, you've come at the perfect time. Robert and Susan here are very concerned about preserving the bakery's legacy. They even went to the trouble of inviting the expert, Mr. Sterling, to consult." She turned to her son, her smile sweet. "Robert, dear, why don't you tell Miss Dana about your vision for the future of the Golden Crust?" Forced into an undeniable position, Robert and Susan had to act. They had to spew platitudes about tradition, community, and family love, while their eyes kept darting to the useless stack of papers on the table. Mr. Sterling, the expert, was completely sidelined, looking awkward and superfluous. The consultation turned into an interview where Carol was the main character, and her son and daughter-in-law were just clumsy supporting actors. After nearly an hour of torture, Mr. Sterling was the first to make an excuse to leave, followed by Robert and Susan with their utterly defeated expressions. When only Carol and lawyer Michael were left, he smiled. "Carol, you are a formidable opponent." "I'm just protecting my home, Michael." That evening, Lily ran to the bakery, her face a mixture of anger and pride. "Grandma, I heard from my parents. You are unbelievable." After this event, any last doubts in Lily's mind vanished. She had completely seen her parents' true colors. "Grandma," Lily said, her voice full of determination, "from now on, I will be your eyes and ears. Any plan they have, anything I hear, I will tell you immediately. We will not let them get away with this." Carol hugged her granddaughter. Their alliance had been forged and was stronger than ever. She knew the fight was not over. After this humiliating defeat, Robert and Susan would surely become more reckless and dangerous. But now she was no longer alone. Of course, after the humiliating defeat, Robert and Susan have no choice but to escalate the fight. Carol will have to face their most ruthless and public attack yet. Let's see how she handles it. The humiliation of that Sunday afternoon did not extinguish Robert and Susan's greed. On the contrary, it added fuel to the fire of their desperation. Having failed at subtle manipulation, they decided to switch to a more ruthless and blatant tactic. They knew that with their financial situation on the brink of collapse, they didn't have much time. A few weeks later, Lily began to hear disturbing whispers from her aunts and uncles. "Mom and Dad have been meeting with a lot of people," she reported to Carol one late evening at the bakery. "They're saying it's to find help for Grandma. They're telling everyone that you're showing alarming signs." Carol knew exactly what that help was. Robert and Susan were spreading their narrative, preparing public opinion for their final assault. And that assault came on a beautiful Tuesday morning. As Carol and Lily were decorating a multi-tiered wedding cake, a man in a court officer's uniform walked into the shop. He wasn't there to buy a cake. He was carrying a thick paper envelope. "Mrs. Carol Hale?" "That's me," Carol replied, her heart beginning to pound. The man handed her the documents. "You've been served." Lily gripped the edge of the table, her face pale. Carol took the papers, her hand cold as ice. When the man left, she tremblingly opened it. It was a petition for guardianship. Robert Hale, her son. The reason Carol Hale, due to cognitive decline and unstable mental health, was no longer competent to manage her assets and personal decisions. Attached were the evidence, testimonies from distant relatives that Robert had manipulated, and, most terrifyingly, a health certificate from a doctor she had never heard of, concluding that she had signs of early-stage dementia. A blatant lie, a slander legitimized by a medical seal. The paper fell from Carol's hands. This shock was even greater than the appraisal folder. This was no longer a fight about money or property. This was an attack on her very dignity, her right to self-determination, her being. They didn't just want to take her bakery. They wanted to take her identity, to turn her into a person with dementia, a child in need of supervision in the eyes of the law and society. She felt a wave of dizziness. The whole world seemed to spin. They had done this. The son she had carried and raised had done this to her. The pain, the hurt, and the feeling of isolation overwhelmed her. For the first time in this fight, Carol felt afraid. She was afraid that lies stamped in red ink could be more powerful than the truth. It seemed all of Carol's hope was extinguished as she faced her own son in court. But the battle for her legacy had only just begun. If you love this story, please like the video and share it with friends you think will appreciate it. The final battle will take place where she is most vulnerable. That night was the longest of Carol's life. She sat alone in her living room, clutching a framed photo of Arthur. She felt completely alone. How could she fight a legal system that could be manipulated by forged documents? How could she prove her sanity when her own son was accusing her? The tears flowed freely, tears of helplessness and hurt. She had almost given up. But as dawn broke, bringing the first faint rays of light, Carol dragged herself to the bakery. She didn't know why she went there, perhaps to say goodbye. But when the door opened, a sight pulled her back from the brink of despair. Lily was there. She wasn't crying. She was working. With a fiery determination on her face, Lily was wiping down each table, rearranging each tray of pastries, her eyes ablaze. Seeing her, Lily stopped, came over, and hugged her tightly. "Grandma, we are not going to lose," Lily whispered, her voice firm. "This place is yours. This legacy is ours. I will not let them take it." Looking at her granddaughter's resilience, at the unwavering love in her eyes, Carol knew she couldn't give up. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for Lily, for the future of the Golden Crust. The fire in her heart flared up again, stronger than ever. Immediately, she called her lawyer, Michael. "They want a war in court, Michael. We'll give them one." The counteroffensive began. Michael, with Carol's help, contacted everyone who could testify. Mr. Henderson from the Planning Council was outraged when he heard the news and agreed immediately. George, the flour supplier, said he would be willing to close his warehouse for a day just to testify to Carol's integrity. The neighboring shop owners, who had witnessed her working hard every day, also eagerly joined. But the most crucial witness was the family doctor, who had been taking care of Carol's health for 20 years. When he heard about the fake health certificate, he was furious. "Senile? Carol is sharper than anyone I know. This is an insult to the medical profession. I will not only testify, I will ask the medical board to investigate the person who issued that paper." Meanwhile, Lily took on another task. She buried herself in the bakery's books, gathering all the invoices, sales reports, and financial documents from the last 3 years. She worked tirelessly, turning the dry numbers into irrefutable proof. Under Carol's management, the Golden Crust was not only not declining, but was also growing steadily and solidly. Carol's house and bakery became a command center. Evidence was collected, witnesses were arranged. The fight was no longer hers alone. It had become the fight of an entire community, people who had been touched by her legacy and who now stood up to protect it. The courtroom in the small county was solemn, the air thick with the smell of polished oak and tension. The light from the cold fluorescent bulbs shone down, highlighting every speck of dust in the air. Carol sat up straight at the defendant's table, next to her lawyer Michael and Lily. She looked so small in her dark blue coat, but her shoulders did not tremble. She looked straight ahead, her eyes unusually calm. On the other side, Robert and Susan sat with their lawyer. Robert kept adjusting his tie as if it were choking him. Susan tried to maintain a pained expression, but her eyes kept darting to the judge, trying to gauge her reaction. The most unusual thing was the audience. It was packed. They were not curious onlookers. They were the familiar faces of the town. Mr. Miller, the neighboring shop owners, the customers who had been loyal to the Golden Crust for decades. They were not there for the drama. They were there to support their Mrs. Carroll. Robert's lawyer began first. He spoke eloquently about his client's deep concern. He presented the evidence, the fake health certificate, the distorted testimonies from relatives, and portrayed Carol as a stubborn, senile old woman who was endangering her own legacy. Robert was called to the stand. He recounted times his mother was forgetful, confused, stories that were so exaggerated they were laughable. Carol just listened in silence. She didn't look at Robert. She looked at her own calloused hands, the hands that had shaped his life. When it was lawyer Michael's turn, the atmosphere in the courtroom seemed to change. "Your Honor," he began, his voice calm but powerful. "The plaintiff has painted a picture of weakness and incompetence. Now, we will show the court the truth. We call our first witness, Mr. Henry Henderson." Mr. Henderson, with the dignified air of a city council member, took the stand. He spoke of his meeting with Carol, of her sharpness in discussing the town's development plans. "Mrs. Hale is not just clear-headed," he concluded. "She has more vision than most of us. To say she has cognitive decline is an insult to her intelligence." Next was George, the flower supplier. With his simple and sincere voice, he recounted how Robert had tried to bribe him. "Mrs. Carroll's integrity is not something that can be bought with money," George said loudly, looking directly at Robert. "And I will never do business with someone who tries to go behind his mother's back." Whispers rippled through the audience. Robert lowered his head. The most decisive witness was the family doctor. As a medical expert, he demolished the fake health certificate with irrefutable medical terms and professional indignation. "Mrs. Hale's health is completely stable. This paper is a lie, an unethical act. I have filed a request to investigate the person who signed it." One by one, the witnesses did not just defend Carol, they were rebuilding her true portrait, a wise, upright, clear-headed woman who was an indispensable part of the community. The picture that Robert and Susan had tried to paint had shattered into pieces. "The defense calls its final witness," Michael announced, "Ms. Lily Hale." Lily took the stand, taking a deep breath. At first, her voice trembled as she spoke of her love for her grandmother and the bakery. She talked about her first lessons, the smell of the pastries, the pride of inheriting a legacy. Then she looked directly at the judge, her voice becoming strong and clear. "They say my grandmother is neglecting her legacy, that she is living in the past. That is completely untrue." She signaled to Michael, who presented a carefully bound document to the judge. "This," Lily said, "is the 5-year business plan for the Golden Crust Bakery that my grandmother and I have been working on together for the past 6 months." The courtroom fell silent. It includes a plan to develop an online ordering system, to partner with local cafes to supply pastries, to open a weekend baking class, and to introduce a new line of organic breads. "We have analyzed the market, budgeted the costs, and forecasted the revenue. This legacy is not being forgotten. It is ready for a brighter future than ever before." That was the final blow. A detailed, ambitious, and completely feasible plan. It was not only irrefutable proof of Carol's clear-headedness, but also a powerful affirmation of the vitality of the legacy they were trying to bury. Robert and Susan were speechless. They looked at the plan with disbelief and utter defeat. The judge reviewed the document. then looked up at Carol, then at Lily, an almost imperceptible smile gracing her lips. She didn't need long to deliberate. She picked up her gavel. The sound was decisive. "After reviewing all the evidence and testimony," she announced, her voice stern, "the court finds that this petition for guardianship is not only without merit, but also shows signs of abuse of the legal process for personal gain. The petition is dismissed." She looked directly at Robert and Susan. "The court sternly warns you about your conduct. Consider this an expensive lesson." A sigh of relief and a quiet applause came from the back. Carol closed her eyes, a single tear rolling down her cheek. But this time, it was a tear of release. Her legacy had spoken, and the whole world had listened. Carol's victory was not just a legal ruling, it was an affirmation from the entire community. As Robert and Susan walked out of the courthouse, they were no longer met with friendly neighbors. Instead, there were cold stares and turned backs. The car door slammed shut like a final end to the social status they had worked so hard to build. News of the trial spread faster than the morning smell of baking bread. But it wasn't just the story of Carol's clear-headedness and Lily's business plan that people were talking about. Whispers about the real reason behind Robert and Susan's actions began to circulate. The huge debt, the failed investments, the pressure from her family. The picture of a successful couple crumbled, revealing a stark reality of desperation and greed. A few days later, Dana's article was published in the local newspaper. It didn't name names, but the whole town understood. With a sharp and empathetic tone, Dana wrote about the resilience of legacies built with love and the tragedy of a later generation that values material wealth over family memories. The article praised people like Carol as the lighthouses of the community, while alluding to those who would be willing to extinguish that lighthouse to sell the lamp. For Robert and Susan, it was a fatal blow. Business partners began to keep their distance. Dinner invitations stopped coming. Even Susan's family, after learning the truth, became distant, ashamed of being dragged into a despicable plan. The external pressure quickly seeped into their home. Lily, on a visit to her parents' house to pick up some things, was forced to witness a fiery argument. Afterward, she went to the bakery, her face still showing a look of shock. "Grandma, I've never seen them like this," Lily recounted, her voice trembling. "They were screaming, blaming each other. Dad said Mom pushed him too far with her unreasonable demands from her mother. Mom then yelled at Dad for being a weak, incompetent man who couldn't provide for his family and had to resort to such a despicable method. It was horrible." Carol listened, her heart aching. She had won the battle to protect her legacy, but she felt no joy in witnessing her son's downfall. This was not what she wanted. She just wanted him to stop. "They have lost their way, Lily," Carol said gently, patting her granddaughter. "When people put greed above all else, they lose the compass that guides their souls. Now they are lost in the storm they created." Robert and Susan's marriage, built on a foundation of ambition and appearances, was now on the brink of collapse. The price of greed was not just a bakery they would never have. It was the respect of the community, the peace of their family, and perhaps themselves. The legacy that Carol successfully protected now shone even brighter in contrast to the ashes they had set on fire. A few months passed, and the town welcomed spring with green shoots and fresh air. At the Golden Crust, a new order had been established. Lily, with confidence and grace, was now the one behind the counter, her smile as radiant as the macarons she had just arranged on the shelf. The 5-year business plan of the grandmother and granddaughter was being implemented, bringing a new vitality to the bakery. Carol no longer had to work all day. She would often sit at her familiar little table in the corner, a cup of tea in her hand, watching the bakery operate with a satisfied smile. Her legacy was not only safe, it was growing, thriving in the hands of the next generation. One Saturday afternoon, as the golden sunlight filled the shop, the bell on the door chimed softly. A man walked in. He looked thinner, more tired, with deep wrinkles on his forehead. He quietly stood in line behind 2 other customers, his eyes on the floor, as if he didn't want to be recognized. It was Robert. When it was his turn, he still didn't look up at Lily at the counter. He just mumbled, his voice almost inaudible. "Can I have a loaf of multigrain bread?" Lily was about to speak, but a warm hand gently placed on her shoulder. Carol had stood up at some point. She said nothing, just quietly went inside, personally selected a still warm loaf of multigrain bread, and carefully placed it in a paper bag. She brought it to the counter and placed it in front of Robert. He looked up, and for the first time in months, mother and son looked directly at each other. In Robert's eyes, Carol no longer saw arrogance or greed, only a deep shame and exhaustion. He tremblingly took out his wallet and offered a bill. Carol gently placed her hand on her son's, pushing the money back. "No need," she said, her voice gentle. "Go home, Robert." Robert's eyes welled up. He couldn't say thank you, nor could he utter an apology. He just nodded, a slow and heavy nod. He took the bag of bread, turned, and walked out of the shop. Carol stood there, watching her son's back until he disappeared. Their relationship might never be the same. The scars would remain. Their future was still a question without an answer. But in that moment, as she handed her son the loaf of forgiveness, Carol knew that her true legacy was not just flour and butter. It was love, resilience, and the hope that, even after the biggest storm, a seed of reconciliation could still be planted. And for her, that was enough.